My neighborhood isn't safe anymore. Things are changing. There are intruders invading these borders. I see them setting up shop on every corner. Cafes trying to corner the market, slicing up bread and dishing dough, delivering the morning fix like we wouldn't notice. Well, I'm putting niggas on notice. Starbucks is coming for us. And them macchiatos make me sick. Baristas blow me. Coffee beans grinds my gears, cause I hear Starbucks is working for the man. And lattes are a part of the redevelopment plan. Cinnamon in the air, daring me to swallow. White lines dividing tar-colored communities till they hollow. Yesterday, I smell cappuccinos in the air, so business suits are soon to follow. Men writing in loose leaf, drinking loose leaf tea, trying to erase me. No love for the cocoa. Less it comes from a third world country where they got it for the low-low. Organic chai in place of impoverished eyes. The Wi-Fi is free. A small fee while they gentrify your community. Trading in your mugshots for mugshots. Cause who could be mad at pumpkin spice? The hood is at its boiling point and they just want to put you on ice. The type that can milk a mocha city white and sugarcoat the strife. Steam rolling the streets while steam milk foams on heat and espresso. Soon you'll be black, surrounded by white. Domino or get delivered to a new postal zone like dominoes. They've come to cut off the competition and decaf the legs you standing on. Shorty in the logo looks like white supremacy. Whipped cream on a brown brew is their idea of diversity, which is to say, white will always come out on top and people of color forever at the bottom. Heated, tell me, why are communities always dark, dismal, and depleted? Yo, for real? Fuck them cups of Joe and them $5 paninis with their tomato, mozzarella, and pesto. See, there is leverage in the beverages. So beware of the caffeine, because you see a Starbucks pop up and you know the developers are coming.
Hello, you're listening to In Search of Black Power. I'm Lawrence Grand Prix.
And I'm Lady Breon. In Search of Black Power is a podcast which challenges conventional narratives around Black policy, Black movements, and Black life.
We're coming to you from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a grassroots think tank in Baltimore, Maryland, with an extended platform, New Timbuktu. You can find out more at www.newtimbuktu.com. Breon, I think we need to talk about cities. They're all the rage, everyone's talking about them, and they seem to be on one of two tracks, either expanding, or some say gentrifying, or shrinking. But in either track, they're really worried about the future. You see all this conversation about what's the future of cities. They're either a utopian vision of what could be, or desperately planning a future where there's some salvation for a struggling city. So, if we're talking about futures and we're talking about cities, maybe we should talk about one of the most prominent depictions of a futuristic city in the world today. So, Breon, did you see Black Panther?
Of course, I saw Black Panther.
And did you see The Avengers? Specifically, do you remember the part of that film where the Wakandan warrior Okoye says that now that Wakanda is open to the world, she hoped Wakanda would get a Starbucks?
Yeah, and I bet they wish that line wasn't in the movie now, because the way Starbucks has been treating Black people, they definitely wouldn't make it past the Wakandan force field.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that this Wakandan warrior, her conception of the progress the world could give Wakanda would be a Starbucks. And I think that's kind of what I want to talk about today. But let's take a step back real quick. So what did you think the first time you saw Wakanda?
I thought it was the most Black-tastic Marvel cinematic production ever made. I mean, Wakanda forever, you dig?
Yeah, it was amazing. It's designed to awe with these futuristic cityscapes. And there's this techno-utopian vision of what an African civilization could be. But to me, in all honesty, it actually looked kind of familiar. Did any of that look familiar to you?
I'm going to have to say no. Not really. I mean, I've never seen anything like Wakanda, so what do you mean when you say it looked familiar?
Yeah, so think about the way they rendered the city. So strip away the kente patterns on the building or the statue roofs on the building. What you see are these big glittering skyscrapers. And to me, it actually looked a lot like the way Dubai is depicted in real life. So while they're going for this novel, never-seen-before vision of an African utopia, I think it's interesting that they kind of replicated the visions of current cityscapes and current city futures from a place in the Middle East.
I mean, personally, I just think designers and architects are all artists, and they're creating something unique, something that is pleasing to the eyes, something that's innovative. And so, yeah, it may have looked a bit like Dubai, but that's still interesting.
Yeah, and I love Black Panther. I think it's a great film. But I do think there's potentially something much deeper at play here when we think about cities and the future and African people and what templates we use to measure the progress of cities.
Okay, that makes sense. So explain.
Okay, so I want to have this conversation within the context of some of what people talk about when they talk about Black Panther. They talk about how important it was that we had these representations on screen of Black heroes and Black female warriors. And I think it was really interesting how so many people didn't just say that it was great to have these cities and civilizations and warriors, but they said they needed it. And to me, the way people often said, this is what I needed, it gave me life, it was affirming, but actually it was a little bit concerning.
I don't know. It wasn't concerning for me at all. I was one of those people who was saying I needed to see Wakanda. I needed to see those woman warriors represented on screen. It was something that was really uplifting for me because that representation is also usually missing. And so it wasn't so much the techno element of the film or the buildings in the film or this, Afrofuturism as much as it was seeing things on screen that represent what I see for myself. So it definitely was something that I needed. So I'm interested in hearing your explanation as to why that was concerning.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that everything you said to me is true. And I think we can say that everything you said can be true, but we can still ask some deeper questions about how this idea of technology and futurism and these depictions that we see about technological civilizations have a deep, deep historical root. And when I say people say they needed a fictional Wakanda, I think that begs a bigger question about how do we think about the Africa that already exists? Why do we need Wakanda when we have so much in our history, not just in general, but specifically around cities, specifically around our culture, that we can pull from to give us what we needed? And if we're looking to these futuristic visions of the city as fulfilling something we need, what are the politics of that? Because I think that the world we see now, people are using the politics of cities and the politics of the futures of cities to do things that we really need to interrogate and break open and understand. So the city is more than just a place. It's a theory of how we should live in the world. So many people are not just saying more of the world's moving to cities, but there's a certain politics of being in a city that's good, that's desirable. This cosmopolitan, worldly, cultural mixing. And it's not just something you see on screen. It's something that's impacting the politics and conversations we're all having. I'm on so many Facebook groups, and everyone in this Facebook group is an amateur urban planner. You see these imaginary subway maps about making the whole United States of America connected via some magical train network. And it's a vision of progress, a vision of the future that fits directly into the politics of progressive America today. And Wakanda fits perfectly within this frame. Think about one of the most prominent depictions in the film is a magnetic levitation subway. It's exactly the type of future that this progressive political discourse is promoting. In Search of Black Power
is made possible by LBS Community Sustainers.
If you want to support this effort, Become a community sustainer
by investing $15, $20, or $50 each month.
Visit lbsbaltimore.com/sustain to sign up.
So if Wakanda shows African people as technologically advanced and proficient, doesn't that answer back the racist notions about black inferiority and the blanketed stereotypes about our inability to progress forward? Like, how can this counter narrative be a bad thing, especially when those stereotypes about black folks are incorrect in the first place?
I completely agree they're incorrect, but I think there might be something deeper here. The very idea that technological progress can be a measure of a civilization is something that has a history to it. There's a book by a guy named Michael Abbas called Machines as the Measure of Men. And he makes the argument you're talking about. It's obviously a myth that European civilizations are more advanced than African civilizations. Africa had been around longer. They made the pyramids. As part of the colonial regime, there was a manufactured mythology that Europeans deserved to colonize the world because they were bringing technological progress to the world. It created a benevolent vision of colonialism because they were bringing all this great technology with them, and that justified their superior position in the world. And this isn't just a way of explaining something that happened. I think it's a cultural framework, one in which gives you a particular way of viewing the world, which is different than some historical African frameworks about progress, civilization, and science.
It's so much more damaging than those overt aspects, the things that are obvious to us. We've got to look deeply and understand the hidden dimension, the dimension of the assumptions that we carry around with us that actually define us to ourselves as unworthy. We're usually not aware when we're doing that. And so what some of us are trying to do is to move to that deep level where we can come to understand that. And the concept of worldview helps us to do that. Worldview and culture are an essential grounding for us, for people generally. Culture is the context of meaningful reality. It is the way in which we get order in our lives. You know, fact is actually dead space and time. A fact is something with no meaning. It can only have meaning when you put it into a context. They tell you take it out of context and then it's something that you can know. That doesn't make any sense at all. So the knower knows this fact. And then by taking it out of this context, by taking it out of experienced reality, we end up with an object. What is the object? That which can be manipulated. And so Africans become objects. And nature becomes an object. And the universe is objectified. And they say that by doing this, then you can have pure thought. And you can be rational. And what rationality means for them is the imposition of their mind on the universe. That's what rationality is.
So if we listen to Marimba Ani, this focus on science and technology creates an object-focused view of the world over a human-focused view of the world. And if we frame our analysis along these lines, might we be using the same exact framework that was used to oppress us in the first place? So I take your point about how we need to celebrate black technology, and it feels like we don't do that enough. But when I started to think about it, I started to realize we actually kind of do celebrate black technology a lot and black inventors a lot. So let's just do this exercise. Off the top of your head, what can you name that black folks invented?
We made the cotton gin, because, you know, slavery was crazy.
Mm-hmm.
The stoplight,
Mm-hmm.
blood transfusions,
Mm-hmm.
and the hot comb by the madam, you know, for the kinks.
Absolutely. And think about, you probably got that knowledge in elementary school, and it was one of the first things they give you in Black History Month. We're not even talking about George Washington Carver and all the other conversations you see online today. So I think we intentionally have this conversation saying, yes, we are technologically advanced. We deserve respect. And that's true. But might that be a form of respectability politics, as some might say? We're still locked into this vision of proving ourselves. But what if the standard we're using to prove ourselves is limited or Eurocentric in the first place? Even Wakanda gets a jump start by random accident with an alien comet falling into their territory. And it makes me think about the real-life technological advancements that African civilizations have made all throughout time.
Just a few years ago in 1978, two American scientists, Schmidt and Avery, discovered that Africans were smelting steel 1,500 to 2,000 years ago in Tanzania. They were smelting it in a machine that was using a semiconductor technology unknown until the 20th century. They were making steel at 1,850 degrees centigrade. No machine, no iron smelting machine in Europe or anywhere else had achieved those temperatures. The highest recorded in Europe was about 1,620 degrees centigrade in a second century furnace, Roman draft furnace. And not only that, not only they found Africans were producing a fine bloom of carbon steel, they were doing it in a single stage, so that even in the middle of the 19th century, when George Wilhelm Siemens, the German, found a method for mass-producing steel, the European process in the mid-19th century involved two stages, whereas the African process involved just one. They were using iron crystallization process in order to produce that steel. And they were doing it not only more efficiently, not only were they producing a finer bloom of steel, but they were doing it using less fuel. The Africans were forced very early into fuel-saving technology. Just a few years ago in 1978, two American scientists, Schmidt and Avery, discovered that Africans were smelting steel 1,500 to 2,000 years ago in Tanzania. They were smelting it in a machine that was using a semiconductor technology unknown until the 20th century. And not only that, not only they found Africans were producing a fine bloom of carbon steel, they were doing it in a single stage, so that even in the middle of the 19th century, when George Wilhelm Siemens, the German, found a method for mass-producing steel, the European process in the mid-19th century involved two stages, whereas the African process involved just one. They were using iron crystallization process in order to produce that steel. And they were doing it not only more efficiently, not only were they producing a finer bloom of steel, but they were doing it using less fuel. The Africans were forced very early into fuel-saving technology.
So if we continue along these lines, we see that the technological advances that African peoples made in real life aren't just something in the past. They're something we can use to give us some framework for our real-life futures, specifically our real-life futures for our cities. There's an example of Mansa Musa. Some people call him the real-life T'Challa, who not only spread so much gold around North Africa and the Middle East, he disrupted the economic markets there. He also was part of a Mali empire that built ships that navigated the ocean before Columbus even knew there was the potential for an America. And I bring this up because African scholars in real life have been using the history of African civilizations and African technology to do real-life in-depth planning for the types of cities and civilizations that we could build.
Les trois premiers spécimens, je n'ai pas besoin de les nommer, n'ont pas atteint, dans l'état actuel de la recherche scientifique, un potentiel d'expansion leur permettant de sortir de l'Afrique. Donc, ils n'ont jamais été hors d'Afrique, dans l'état actuel des recherches.
So I know what you heard was a bunch of French, but that's actually Cheikh Anta Diop. And he not only was a political theorist, he was actually a scientist. And he actually used his knowledge of science, history, and political theory to design templates for political evolutions for African civilizations after independence. He talks about food sources, transportation. He, for example, is not a big fan of trains. He thinks they cost too much. Political developments. And if we have so much of this in real life, I guess that's the reason why I felt so concerned that people said they needed Black Panther. Because what does that mean about how we relate to what we already have?
I guess my issue here is, first and foremost, it's a movie, right? And because it's a movie, maybe I'm just not seeing it as a guide for political theory, right? And I don't know if people saying they needed to see Black Panther is the same as I don't know about the greatness that exists for African people in real life, right? Like, it's a movie and we just doing it for the culture.
So I want to focus on that last thing you said. If we're doing it for the culture, what is culture? I think that it is important that we have depictions like Black Panther, but I get worried that folks limit culture in its definition to food, dress, dance, when it's way more than that. A definition of culture that we use sometimes, and this is just paraphrasing, is that culture is the totality of thought and practice from which a people sustains itself, celebrates itself, and introduces itself to history and humanity. And I think if you're using that definition of culture, it's not just maybe what you could see on the screen for Black Panther. It's a mental operating system. It's a way of evaluating knowledge. It's a form of technology in and of itself. And how can we use the cultural technologies of Africa to think about new and more innovative ways to think about representations or how we engage politically? There are examples from African history of urban planning reflecting African culture. There's this notion called Ubuntu, I am because we are. And if you look at this book called African Fractals, you see African cities sometimes were planned not around technological skyscrapers, but around human interactions and designing a society in which people engage each other in productive, more egalitarian ways. There's Nomo, the cultural technology of the spiritual power of the word, which produces the griot cultures in different West African civilizations. There's matrilineal organizational systems, whereby your descent is seen through the line of the mother, which Cheikh Diop directly says needs to be harnessed in the way we produce political civilizations, the way we have to center women in our political order. So when you look at that, I think there are some questions you have to ask. For example, I wondered watching Black Panther, where's Killmonger's mother? And are we having an accurate depiction of cultural systems if that matrilineal line has been severed? Where are they going on this magical magnetic levitation light rail? What are the social, political implications of this technology? And I think when we don't look at the cultural resources for development, we ignore the reality of how terrible it was that we lost these cultural resources and what it means about how we lost them.
We know very little, or rather we have known very little of the technologies of early Africa because of this concentration on the primitive. I grew up in a jungle twice as large as any jungle in Africa. Africa, in fact, has less jungle than any other continent comparable with its land space. If you take two Europes and put it in Africa, there is more woodland and forest in two Europes than there is in Africa. Our image of jungle springs from the fact that most anthropologists, at least in the past, it may be changing slightly now, and with these studies it will change even more rapidly. Most anthropologists have been satisfied to go looking for vanishing little tribes, utterly irrelevant, the Booga Booga and the Luga Booga. And they go and they spend 6 months a year and they study all they know about the Luga Boogas. All their little ritual and their dances and their kinship system, who is my mother's brother, sister, son, etc. Utterly irrelevant to any illuminating vision of African civilization. And they come and they extrapolate masses of things about it. And so we have thousands and thousands of books about Africa that tell us absolutely nothing about the quintessential Africa.
So I guess that's why I wanted to talk about some of this history. Because not only do we risk not turning to Africa for its cultural resources, we risk ignoring the violence and erasure which makes us feel like there's nothing there even to look for.
Lawrence, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that you're right in the ways that we do not see culture as technology, and that we evaluate African culture and, Black folks in a different way than, European culture or technology and et cetera, right? But for me, I think it's also important to note that Black Panther as a movie is an Afrofuturistic production. It is an imagined universe of what Africa could be and what Africa should be if it wasn't interrupted by European colonization. So there may be a world where Africa would have all of those technological advances in addition to the cultural technology, right? And so we can't talk about all the marvels of Africa's past and not also see the possibility for the spectacular in its future, right? And so Wakanda is, for me, a very important representation of that possible future. And even if it's partly a replica of the white imagination, I think that's to be expected, especially since the media itself has been whitewashed.
Yeah, I think Wakanda is a blank slate upon which people can project their hopes. But I also, feel that we need to be careful what we wish for. Because if the model for Wakanda are these European cities, built up, technological, Paris, London, how did those cities come to be? And if we look at the history of how these cities were produced, we see something dark there. We see that it was the extraction of resources that not just impacted the cities, but the very populations of these countries, the demographics of these countries. So much so that some people have coined the term to explain how these cities came about, demographic parasitism, like parasites.
Demographic parasitism. I don't really know what that is. And because I'm a person who loves words, I hear demographic and think people, and hear parasite and think leech. So are you saying this term means one group of people literally leeching off of another?
Yeah, and it'll actually set us up for the next conversation I want to have. So let's take a step back and talk about this guy named Thomas Malthus. He is a British theorist of populations, and he had an idea that while resources increase linearly, like a straight line going vertical, populations increase exponentially. So they double, then the double doubles, then that double doubles, and it produces like a J curve. Starts off going up slow, then it explodes straight up. Some people have used his theories of population to say our population growth will outstrip our ability to find more resources. And in the world we live in, people put that in racial terms. It was the black or brown nations as of 30, 40, 50 years ago, which had the highest fertility rates. And the European nations were leveling off in terms of their birth rates. So people said there was basically a population bomb being born in these brown and black nations, which would create a threat to civilization itself. They would need so much resources, they would need so much investment that it would create a threat to the world we lived in. Some people thought this was wrong and basically tried to flip it. So instead of seeing the black or brown people as the threat to civilization, it explains that the only reason Europe got to be so developed, so urbanized, had such big cities where you don't need so much manual labor, i.e. labor force, i.e. population, is they were exporting their need for manual labor to their colonies and their slaves. So the only reason Europe got to build up these big, beautiful cities with all these beautiful skyscrapers if they had population or demographic dynamics which were conducive to this. And that was only because they were parasites upon the black and brown world. So my concern is that when we're mimicking Paris and London and we're saying this is the future, it's inevitable, we're naturalizing a really unnatural vision of what the future can be or should be, because the only examples we've had in the past that have worked have been from this demographic parasitism.
It makes me wonder, though, are you saying that there is no world or alternative where we can have a technologically advanced society or nation that is not built off the backs of its poor or its slaves?
I'm saying that's a wonderful question, and I would love to ponder it. But the problem is people are so desiring of technological futures that we're being sold this vision of technological progress in our cities that has nothing to do with social justice, that has nothing to do with a new vision of how the world could work, but just gives us a vision of the future that feels good, that feels like Black Panther, to be honest. But the way it's being produced is the exact same exploitative system that produced Paris and London in the world we're trying to look past. Just look here in Baltimore.
We will build it.
Together.
Port Covington.
And when we build it,
It will be ours.
Port Covington, a bold vision for Baltimore that'll fuel economic growth, bringing thousands of jobs to Baltimore City.
New businesses.
New jobs. Good jobs.
At the heart of it, a new world headquarters for Under Armour. Built in Baltimore, staying in Baltimore.
We're going to sell our bags here.
We're going to have a store here.
I could work in one of the new office buildings.
Shops.
Public parks.
Families.
Parks and playgrounds open to the public, family restaurants, manufacturing space, and more. Better transit to jobs and opportunity for all of Baltimore.
I'll be able to play in one of the new parks.
Entrepreneurs. Innovators.
we will build it together.
We will build Port Covington for us.
This will be big. Baltimore big.
Port Covington. We will build it together.
Now, I know you don't see it, but you can just imagine what this YouTube video looks like. It looks like Wakanda. Big, glittering skyscrapers. Listen to the Black children. This is our city. We're going to build it. And of course, this is global finance capital produced by a corporation whose CEO tacitly supports Donald Trump. But it feels so good to see Black people standing next to all this technological progress. And what's the kicker? What are they going to bring potentially to Port Covington that proves it's the future? None other than a magnetic levitation train.
Where it all began, officials said we're on track for an incredible future.
I'm excited about being able to travel to D.C. in 15 minutes.
A train that floats 4 inches off the ground, propelled by magnets faster than 300 miles per hour, connecting our nation's capital to the Big Apple in an hour.
You're looking at the future of transportation, and it begins in Maryland. The maglev train, going 311 miles per hour, will take passengers from BWI Thurgood Marshall Airport to downtown Baltimore in 8 minutes. Baltimore to D.C. in 15, and D.C. to New York in an hour. A House committee got a briefing on the status of the maglev from state transportation officials and project managers.
We are down to really 3 options available to the study. One is no build. The next is the east side of the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. The other is the west side of the Baltimore-Washington Parkway.
Project managers considered all route options and now prefer the east side of the BW Parkway because it wouldn't require tearing down any homes.
You'd probably start construction sometime late in 2020, somewhere 5 to 7 years in terms of construction.
75% of the maglev will be underground. There's no state funding involved. Japan is putting in $5 billion and has already signed an agreement to allow the project to use the same technology as their high-speed train. Federal railroad grants will also be tapped. The maglev will create 74,000 construction jobs and 1,500 jobs after opening. The North American Building Trades Union signed an agreement to use union labor.
The magnetic levitation train. Same exact train they show you in Black Panther. They're literally saying, we can make Baltimore Wakanda. Just give us free reign, give us these tax breaks, and we can bring the future to you. But it goes even deeper. The justification they're using is that Baltimore is in a demographic time bomb. It's not the same as what they talked about with Africa. Now they're saying the population of Baltimore is shrinking. The tax base is shrinking. And the only way to allow that tax money to come in and provide government services is to bring in rich people who can pay more taxes. The term I use for this is they're hunting for the white whale. These affluent people who can come and buy a very expensive house so they can pay more property taxes. So we're being sold a vision of the future, and told this is the only way to stop a population bomb, in this case from a shrinking city, from exploding in our faces. And in that world, I can't help but be really, really skeptical of the way in which our visions of the future are being used against us.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And Under Armour as a brand is for those, posh jocks and athletes. So it makes perfect sense that their sort of development wouldn't reflect social justice, and you wouldn't even imagine that they would.
And that's where I want to transition to another analogy. And it may feel harsh, but I think it's important to at least think about this idea. So the person who runs Under Armour talked well about Donald Trump, but before that, he was a prominent supporter of Barack Obama. He actually played golf with him. The folks on these Facebook groups who are talking about how to save the city, making all these beautiful transit maps, they're liberals. The cosmopolitan, multicultural ethos is a liberal ethos. And it's actually, in many places, the liberals around the world who talk about population control. And when you think about population control, this fear of populations exploding, this fear of demographics, you get to a level where people start to feel like supervillains, and people start to feel like the villain from the Avengers film, Thanos.
Okay, you lost me. What does Mr. Infinity Stones himself have to do with any of this?
Well, remember Thomas Malthus. His theories about population, again, resources increase, straight line. Population increases way faster than that. It's a problem. Some people took an even darker lean to that theory. And they said that in order for the world to survive, we may have to let some people die. We may have to have forced population control, controlling reproduction, in the name of protecting civilization. Thanos is a Malthusian. His theories don't come from nowhere. And some people feel this fear over demographics animates not only the right, fear of immigration, fear of a black planet, but also the left. And they're willing to control populations to save the future, to save their cities.
For me, Malthusian folks or Thanosites just don't make sense to me, because in the age of technology and globalization and the overproduction of food, I just don't get the current argument for sterilization or any other form of population control, because there is so much excess of everything. So even if we as people grow exponentially, so does everything else.
That was proven true. Thomas Malthus is wrong. They use this term carrying capacity. How many people can the earth hold? To counter this idea of the population bomb. And every time the bomb was supposed to explode, we found resources increases, but also people voluntarily choose as cultures to have less children.
Today, in the world, the average is 2.5. Imagine, it used to be 50 years ago 5, and the world has changed. The average number of babies born per woman have gone from 5 to 2.5, and it's still decreasing. What a big change. People would think that Bangladesh and countries like that is some sort of epicenter of a population bomb. They couldn't be more wrong. The problem here is not lack of knowledge, it's preconceived ideas. The British cannot even imagine, cannot even guess that women in Bangladesh have 2.5, and it's really 2.2 already. This is what the Brits don't know, that Taslima and her family are the norm in Bangladesh today.
People couldn't even guess that these people were already limiting their population growth, because the theory is they'll never change. And that's where the subtle racism kicks in. These racist logics that black or brown people are hypersexual. They can't not have children because they can't stop having sex. So for most people, it would be unthinkable that we would actually say eliminate half the universe's population like Thanos does. And that's why I want to talk about this, because if you look at some cities in America right now, this is already happening. Between the prison industrial complex, between the folks on parole and probation, between the folks who are evicted and the folks who are priced out of the cities. The number in gentrifying neighborhoods of the resident population that has to leave is just about 50%. Now, it's not killing them, but you are destroying a community, and you are willing to depopulate it in the name of protecting the future. And as much as we talk about social justice on the left, we here at LBS know that so-called leftists will be willing to resort to population control policies if they feel they need to. Just this last political session in our state capital, Annapolis, there was a hugely regressive Back to the Future crime bill that reintroduced mandatory minimums and lock 'em up thinking. What is that other than population control? And how did they justify it? They said it's the only way that people will feel safe working and playing in downtown Baltimore. Goes even deeper than that. There's this thing called right-sizing cities, like correctly sizing them, saying they grew too big in the past, and now it costs too much money to support the whole city with resources and services. So we literally have to chop up the city and figure out what portions of it do we want to save and what portions of it do we stop giving services to save the rest of the city. In places like Detroit, this has been interpreted, according to many scholars, in racialized terms. The social life of black folks, the community institutions, they don't register on the map of the urban planners. So they're more willing to chop off those parts of the city and give resources to the urban core, which they can then gentrify. I guess what I'm saying is, sometimes a supervillain sounds like what you'd expect. Big, booming voice threatening to destroy the universe. And sometimes they sound like this.
There's been cities, particularly in the northeast, in the Rust Belt, that for 50 or 60 years, in fact, have been shrinking in population. And for 50 or 49 of those 50 years, their strategy was, next year everybody's coming back. Well, they finally figured out that ain't the case. That's not going to happen. And so this approach called right-sizing has kind of emerged, and here's the kind of industry definition. Readjusting a city's, shrinking city's built environment, its buildings and infrastructure, to match its current and projected population and development trends.
Within categories that include walkability, economic opportunity, engagement, real estate, we've got metrics that range from immigrant and migration to sidewalk condition to tree cover, public transportation access, a whole host of metrics that really are aimed to help get a broad sense of what's going on in order to make really strategic decisions on the ground. And we are outsiders, and I think that in some ways really does benefit ReLocal. We're coming in with a data-driven approach to working in cities and helping make strategic decisions. But we recognize, as Don said, we don't have that local knowledge, and so it's really important for us to engage locally in different ways that I'll go into because that's the core of how we're going to be effective, is to make sure that we're meeting local need and engaging locally.
It's the everyday violence against black folks that never rises to the level where you make a movie about it, but has the same level of devastation on black communities. Here in Baltimore, they announced millions of dollars to demolish vacant homes, but no money to restore communities impacted by the war on drugs. All those community institutions, those youth groups, those grandmothers building with black community are destroyed when you destroy these communities. And what the city says is that our city is at stake, and it's only if we destroy portions of it are we able to save it. And the most problematic thing is even their vision of restoring the city, restoring these black neighborhoods, requires their destruction. Think about how they talk about building up new jobs and building up the urban core so black folks can go there and work. If you think about it from a different perspective, that's actually sucking the best talent of the black community out of the black community and having them serve in communities where the money and the resources don't flow back. So we talk about how great the cities are, how diverse they are, and there is this desire to feel multiculturalism as something cool, something to consume. And while the proponents of the new city say this is the future, it feels like a form of vampirism. I think sometimes about the jobs they promise to bring. This is the way we'll save the city. is with this infusion of money and capital, and these new jobs will spring up like magic from nowhere. And I think about the types of jobs these typically are: service economy jobs, greeters, security guards, cashiers, secretaries. And while this is proposed to be the future, I think about Frantz Fanon, a famous theorist who talked about the smile of the other is always a gift. There's an expectation for you to smile and be happy while you're working in an environment that's so full of structural violence. And in these jobs that they promise to bring, that's the best that you can do, is be forced to smile and serve the gentrifiers while the community you knew is being hollowed out or destroyed. So this might not be actual supervillains, but we should talk about the threat that this way of thinking, this vision of the future serves for our community, because those who control your vision of the future might just control your present.
So, Lawrence, you talk a lot about our need for technological advancement being used as a tool for gentrification, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think there are other vectors as well of gentrification.
What might that be?
Okay, well, let me ask you this. What are some indicators that you are standing in a recently gentrified community?
So you might have new condos.
Mm-hmm.
You might have a Starbucks.
Mm-hmm.
You might have a dog park, for example.
Right. And to add to that, I often notice that community art shifts due to urban renewal.
Oh, yeah. You mean like the murals that pop up, the street art and the galleries that seem to just come out of nowhere.
Exactly. In fact, my argument is that white yuppie artists are the purveyors of gentrification, and a change in public art is often stage one of the gentrification process and becomes a signifier that initiates this new wave of development. So let me take a step back. I know many may have heard the term gentrification before, but I don't want to assume that every listener actually knows what we mean when we say gentrification. You may hear terms like upscaling, urban renewal, transformation, redevelopment, or economic development. And although many of these are not synonymous, they are often used interchangeably. And they all really mean one thing. As blogger Tabitha Wharton put it, when an area is gentrified, a once blighted community is repaired, reoccupied, and revitalized. This doesn't go without, hard work and dedicated people, and it isn't an overnight process. It often takes several years for gentrification's positive effects to become apparent to the naked eye, and even longer than that for the neighborhood or area to be considered a success. A simple Google search will yield layman's definitions like gentrification is the process of making a person or activity more refined or polite. But it's easiest to find the definition by looking at its roots. As I showed before, I love words, and the term gentry means people of good social position, or in the UK, the class of people next below nobility in position and birth. So gentrification is literally the process of creating a space for the affluent, for the well-to-do, for the high society. I mean, it's all in the name. Now, that may seem rather innocent when you hear it at a very surface level, but there are nuanced reasons that make gentrification a cringy, hot-button topic for Black folks around the nation. And the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what does it mean to create a space for the affluent? What does it look like? And how does it affect the surrounding communities? And the second question we must ask is, where are these affluent communities being created, and what was previously in those places? In other words, who or what are the gentrifiers replacing? And once you start to answer those questions, you'll start to understand the real issues around gentrification. For starters, let's look at the typical communities that are gentrified. Urban sociologists would categorize them as Zone 2 of industrial cities, which are located just outside of a city's financial or business districts and are places that once housed the workers of those local industries but are now full of vacant buildings and are crime-ridden and poverty-stricken. And what is left out of this description is that those neighborhoods are often largely Black or communities of color. And a part of gentrification's success is that it attracts new business, both local and national, to an area that would otherwise be completely written off. So if you go back to Lawrence's example about Port Covington, or you think about any other communities that were built up, right? It's that attraction of new business, again, both locally and nationally, that create this successful gentrification model, right? But those people that were in those communities still have their own culture, they have their own aesthetic, they have their own way of life, even if the city and its developers or new businesses don't recognize it. And thus, the evil of this transferal of places from one class to another is a few things. Thinking about it as an artist and a person that studies culture, the first thing is it renames a place, right? And this is completely linguistically erasing a space. 2, it often demolishes that place, which is physically erasing the significant sites. It rebuilds, which is oppressive in nature because it's an architectural representation of a hierarchy showing what is and is not viewed as important. And it repurposes space, which is perhaps even more offensive because developers will retain the shell of a building to accrue tax benefits or what have you, while still erasing the significance of the original space in that community, completely commodifying another culture or history for their own advantage.
So I get your critique of gentrification, but why are you calling artists the purveyors of it in the first place?
Okay, so let's be clear. Art and cultural production existed in these low-income and marginalized communities that often come to be gentrified far before the term gentrification was ever coined. And the art that was produced did not affect the local real estate or inflate the property value or attract the interest of local developers or national developers. It was just another component of that neighborhood's character. And then 2 things changed. First, different kinds of people started to move into the city, right? Now, we got to take a step back to understand what I mean. It started with the suburbanization of America and the effects of redlining, where post-World War II, the federal government created subsidy programs for white single-family homeowners and subsequently drew red lines mapping out districts of predominantly black neighborhoods in which bankers were less likely to give loans, white families were encouraged not to move there, and lower-quality homes were sold at balloon rates to black families. This white flight, as many called it, and redlining gave rise to very homogenized upper and middle class white communities that lacked diversity, they lacked vibrance, and they created a space for stay-at-home moms and the model nuclear families, while also at the same time crippling those black communities and causing economic hardship and disinvestment. But this intentional racial and wealth separation left the children of those white flight pioneers later in life yearning to return to the city their parents migrated from. They longed for the hip streets, the grunge appeal. The suburbs was a sterile place, and the city was fringe and intriguing. But it wasn't enough to just re-enter the city and immerse themselves into the city's way of life. They re-entered the city and they brought the best parts of the suburbs with them. Essentially, they wanted to put an urban trench coat over a suburban outfit. They wanted the warehouses, the grunge, the high-rises, the drugs, the allure of danger. They could actually touch it. They wanted the local transit and the business districts, but they did not want to sacrifice the farmers markets, the gated communities, their $4 coffees, or the plush upholstery. The term creative class was actually coined by Richard Florida, an American studies theorist, to encourage cities to carve out more space for creatives because creatives can bolster the economy and increase jobs. So Richard Florida looked at the ways in which artists were coming back to cities and the way that that was affecting the cities and created a whole theory about why mayors and city planners should all get behind this move of artists back into cities.
The main message of my work over the past decade or more has been a fairly basic message, and that's that every single human being is creative. But then, as with anything, one has to put statistical parameters around what that means. And what I found is that in the United States and around the world, our society is really dividing into people who are principally paid to use their creativity at work, and those who may be quite creative, but they're principally paid to use their physical labor, or they're involved in low-skill service work. In any event, there are about 40 million Americans who are privileged to be members of what I call the creative class. There are people in science and technology. There are people who are entrepreneurs who work in research and development. They're architects, they're designers, they work in arts and culture, the entertainment and media, and then the kind of classic knowledge-based professionals that great management thinkers like Peter Drucker taught us about. People in business and management and healthcare and law and education. Right now in the United States, it's about 35% of the workforce. But what's interesting is through the terrible economic crisis we've had, while rates of unemployment for manufacturing workers went over 15%, and in some cases over 20%, and for people who do low-skill service work like food preparation or personal care, that kind of work went well over 10%. The rate of unemployment amongst the creative class never went higher than 5%. And we're on track to generate another 7 million of these jobs over the course of the next decade. And one thing that's really interesting, when I first look at the creative class in the original version of the book in 2002, in the most advanced regions of the country, places like San Francisco or the Silicon Valley or Boulder, Colorado or Austin, Texas or Seattle or Boston, Raleigh, Durham, Washington, D.C., there might have been 35 or 40%. Now in some of these regions, almost 50% of the workforce, we're sitting in Manhattan today, and in New York County, which is Manhattan, it's nearly half of the workforce is already in this creative class. And we have been able to look around the world, and I added a whole new chapter on that in this book. In some countries like Singapore, or in Sweden, or in Norway, or in Denmark, the Netherlands, already more than 45 to 50% of the workforce is doing this kind of creative class work. So in my view, it's the growth force of our time, and the real challenge ahead of us is how do we get more and more people involved in creative class work, using their minds, using their creativity, because it will afford them a better salary, it'll improve productivity, and it'll hopefully begin to address the terrible inequality we face in our country.
And here in this clip, he explains a bit about the benefits of the creative class. The very last part of his statement is interesting to me, because not only does he believe that the creative class can help strengthen and bolster an economy, but he also, for some reason, believes that the creative class can stand against injustice and inequality in this country. But this analysis lacks a historical and racial analysis. As an artist myself, I'm inclined to agree and even support the notion that a creative class can stimulate local economies, right? But I also know that in the 70s, the art industry rose to be a nearly $45 billion industry. But there is a hierarchy within that very industry. Fine art, or high art, is very different than what is produced in inner city communities, in predominantly Black communities, in brown communities. And so white students around the nation started to flood colleges to get masters of fine arts or bachelors of fine arts to get a piece of this billion-dollar pie. But Black folks were often cut out of that market entirely. And with their suburban taste and newly acquired art degrees, they transplanted themselves into dilapidated inner city communities with one aim: to break into that market and win big. So when Florida is talking about the creative class, he's very much so talking about those white yuppie artists who have now gotten degrees and are moving back into the city. And he is trying to convince us that making a space for only them is best for community. And these artists, they could have moved into well-to-do areas where fine art galleries already existed. They could have worked their way up the ladder to break into the market like anyone else. But instead, they make an intentional choice to move to communities of color and use them as their canvas. Sarah Schulman, the author of Gentrification of the Mind, Witness to a Lost Imagination, says, it's a currency move. They see it as a way to access power because other white artists and people who run the market also live there. And as Peter Moskowitz writes, rising real estate values also create a feedback loop for the art market. You have to be wealthier to live in places like New York or other bolstering places these days. So artists in gentrifying city creates art that sells for more money, which creates an art market less concerned with social value of art and more concerned with aesthetics that appeal to the wealthy, which feeds into this MFA system that creates more market-oriented artists who then move to cities and produce aesthetically pleasing but conceptually vacuous art. So again, we think back to the Port Covington example. We would expect companies like Port Covington to do things that are socially just for the communities that they sit in, right? Because that's not their aim. They're not coming here to be a benefit to the community. They're coming here to make money. And these artists are often going to these communities to make money. And you can make the most money when your expenses, where you live, and the market is just not there. And you're creating it yourself. This creates another complex, an educational industrial complex, because these white students get expensive college degrees that provide mediocre training, which oftentimes does not lead to a career in the art sector itself, unfortunately, and they move into these gentrifiable communities, take up space, with rent oftentimes paid by their parents for the first few years, and again, end up working in a community far different than what they went to school for. So not only are these artists coming in and creating spaces for themselves on top of communities of color, but they don't even oftentimes stay in the artist's career. And so it produces a cycle. They're fed the dream that art is the way to go, that I can make so much money in this billion-dollar industry. And when it doesn't happen, they've already moved into these spaces. They've already brought their piece of the suburbs back into the city, created a space that feels comfortable, even though it was at the expense of displacing so many people of color, and now it's home for them. And the cycle continues. But artists cannot gentrify communities on their own. Yes, they do come in and repurpose vacant buildings with their DIY spaces and the like. But the most permanent changes come when local government create tax abatement programs or grants and other incentives that give artists the tools and resources they need to transform these sought-after low-income communities. To make matters worse, cities often own a number of the abandoned buildings in blighted communities and just sit and watch communities deteriorate on their own accord. Baltimore has over 16,000 vacant, uninhabitable buildings. When you loosen that definition, the number of counted vacant properties rises to over 40,000. And issues around redlining, disinvestment, and discriminant laws help us explain how we got to this point. But cities will bring in developers, like Baltimore, and level whole communities to rebuild suitable living for what Florida calls the creative class. Developers also follow the trends of these migrating artists. They create plans and streetscapes that complement the urban-suburban hybrid plans that the new hipstervilles require. And supporters of gentrification will argue that revitalization and neighborhood changes are natural, that it's simply the way things are. Neighborhoods change and grow and transform all the time. But the difference for me is that while some communities assimilate to new ways of life, Black neighborhoods are transformed through attrition. The shift is aggressive and harsh and oppressive, and any other description is a distortion of the truth. We're not moving because we want to. These artists become the purveyors of the onslaught of trauma and displacement, of erasure and cultural dismemberment. Black folks, again, are not just leaving because of upward mobility or better opportunities or better qualities of life oftentimes. Their communities are demolished. And as Ryan Deutsch writes in The Fine Art of Gentrification, gentrification is an important aspect of the strategy for impoverishment. By creating neighborhoods and housing that only the white-collar workforce can afford, the city is systematically destroying the material conditions for the survival of millions of people. And artists make it all look pretty. They make it all palatable. But as Kim Levin, an artist, put it, who cares, as long as they're trying to show good art? And what is even more remarkable is that gentrification has become so normalized, so everyday, that it is commonplace to see a new development erected right on your doorstep without any notice. Today's local government and developers often bypass this first phase of gentrification altogether. They no longer need the artistic lube to enter communities of color and start the slow process of class transference because, unfortunately, there aren't many left willing to put up a fight against gentrification because gentrification itself has become a way of life.
Peace. My name is Adam Jackson, and I'm the CEO of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, Baltimore's grassroots think tank. In 2010, when we first started, our primary goal was to make sure that Baltimore's Black community had a voice in the halls of power so that we could transform our communities. Our work continues today, not just in the form of legislative advocacy, but in the form of this podcast, In Search of Black Power. Growing up in West Baltimore, I saw a lot of the devastation that impacted Black people when we don't have any investment in our communities. So it's important for us that people from the community support our work, people like you. If you want to support our work, sign up to become a community sustainer today. You can go to the website at lbsbaltimore.com/sustain to sign up today.
So, Breon, your conversation about art and gentrification got me wondering, as an artist, do you have personal experience with seeing some people benefit from the artistic focus on redevelopment while other people benefiting less?
Yeah, I think Station North is a perfect example in Baltimore. Station North is one of the arts and cultural districts here, one of the oldest ones, and maybe in the last decade, people have really started to see that community, Greenmount, Barclay, and et cetera, change due to Station North. And because the process was so slow, it was hard for people to really see the changes, but now I think it's apparent. The mica transplants, the artists that may work in Sparky Pants, a tech company that's in that area, and et cetera, have started to really change the demographic of that area, right? They started to put up murals that don't represent the community that it sits in at all. It attracted new businesses like Impact Hub that if you walk in, you might see Black art on the wall, but the population that they really serve are not the people that live in that community. You'll see artistic workspaces that really, again, does not lend itself to people who are producing art that is indigenous to that community. It is the art, it is the workforce, it is the creative class, if you will, that developers want to be in that community but don't currently live there. I've gone to gallery spaces there, repurposed warehouses there. They have sort of a streetscape event that they have on Oliver Street, and it is so white and so different than what I know Greenmount to be. And it would be beautiful if an art district in a Black community somehow reflected the Black art that already existed in that community. But what you saw was the graffiti street art and, the depictions of young Black girls that was on murals being either replaced or overshadowed by the MICA students and the Station North artists putting up their own representations of art that just doesn't reflect the Black Baltimore that I know. So I think that's a great local example of what that looks like. And now, the real development is coming in. Now you got condos being built on Greenmount. Who would have thought? Right? City Arts 1 and 2 are actually, artist affordable housing. And I know as an Black artist myself, I would have loved to have these kind of options a long time ago, but it wasn't until these mica transplants or white artists and et cetera needed a place to go or started to envision what an art district could look like that we had those opportunities in Baltimore. And it's just really unfortunate.
Yeah. I think people are seeing this story all over the country, and it's hard for them to be precise about the critique. Because what I see happening sometimes is that they'll go to a community group like a step team or a marching band and have them perform at their events. This is the new entity that's doing the gentrification. And folks say, look, they're inclusive. They're bringing in community groups. While I think what you're saying is that how come the community group themselves can't own city arts, can't have an incubator where they can have a step team or African drumming or different forms of indigenous art that can be cultivated and invested in. And linking the two talks together, I think some people feel like, oh, that's the past. We can't go back to the past when we had black folks on that African stuff, or that's the past of Baltimore. The future of Baltimore needs to be these MICA kids and these big multimedia, flashy examples of what they're creating and not what black folks did, which doesn't feel new, doesn't feel like something they can market and invest in.
And I think that's true. And I think it's a very dangerous analysis around what's happening, because I think another current example, still using Station North, two very similar organizations or institutions rather, one that was black owned and black run and one that came as a result of Station North. There is an institution called the Living Well. It used to sit, just maybe a mile, if that, away from the designation of Station North. And again, this is a performance space. This is a space where you can hold classes, a space where you can have, artistic incubation, but it definitely had a collective model, right? This Ubuntu model built into the institution itself. And it was crowded out by Impact Hub, which is a national model that essentially does the exact same thing. And the folks who brought Impact Hub to Baltimore thought it made sense to put a new institution that is exactly what a black institution was already doing in that neighborhood there. And because, you paint it with this veneer of community involvement in black art, people assume that it's the same thing, only bigger and better, and then they all go to Impact Hub and leaving, the Living Well, essentially having to move and, sort of start over. And for you, Lawrence, one of the questions that I had coming out of your talk is, we say that it's dangerous to look at technological advancement as a measure of success, particularly for black communities. And I'm just wondering, what does that success look like if we're not looking at technological advancement?
So when I talk about culture being a technology, I do think if we see culture as a technology, we need to understand cultures in much more depth and detail, and then see if we can have these cultures function in ways where they're doing more work to build up community. Interesting you bring up that example of the Impact Hub, because I actually went to a meeting at the new Black Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and they actually said they had an exhibit at the Impact Hub. This is the Black Smithsonian in D.C., and they actually had people come and do archival work using these brand new archiving machines that this institution had. And to me, I heard that a local black museum, the Great Blacks and Wax, had to go to Impact Hub to digitize their archives. And to me, that was a prime example of the failure that we have when we envision progress as centered on technology. Because you're making it so that the Great Blacks and Wax Museum, which has a lot of cultural technologies the Impact Hub doesn't have, but you're making them dependent upon Impact Hub to digitize their archive and giving this new institution, like you said, the veneer of legitimacy. And they actually said it's because they had better Wi-Fi. It's because they had better handicap accessibility. It's because they were more centrally located that they chose Impact Hub. And so we really have to stop using those types of metrics that are always going to favor institutions with more capital and more access to white privilege. But begin to, what if you could measure the work that the founders of the Great Blacks and Wax Museum did? They wrote a whole book on social work that attempted to redefine the frame of social work from a cultural lens. And the things that they do as an institution reflect that. So I think we as a community oftentimes ask this question about, well, if what we use now doesn't work, what does work? If we have this critique of what exists, how can we transition into something different? And I think we need to just spend a whole episode talking about a new vision of how we measure success, a new vision of what we could build if we had the time and space, a new vision of the future for cities, but specifically Baltimore, that could reflect an alternative to what we've critiqued.
And if you're interested in hearing about those alternatives, please tune in next time to In Search of Black Power.
Thank you for listening to In Search of Black Power. Make sure to follow us, like, and subscribe on Twitter and Instagram at LBS Baltimore and on Facebook at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. You can find this podcast at www.thenewtimbuktu.com and on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you can find podcasts. You can also support us and become a sustaining member at www.lbsbaltimore.com.
In Search of Black Power was created by Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, hosted by Lawrence Grand Prix and myself, Lady Breon. Our associate producer is Iyori Odigizuwa, and our engineer is Justin Gladden. Our research assistant is Aaron Brown, logistical support from Nadira Smith, and a thanks to the whole #LBS gang. We'll see you next time in Search of Black Power.